We have Mr. Allatt. Mr. Ben Allatt is with us, and he is an HR consultant with Alternative HR. He works with clients on building and maintaining and growing their HR functions and provides training and strategic guidance on growing their human capital. He'll speak about some key aspects of onboarding with an eye on recruiting and the interview process, as well as performance management. Mr. Allatt, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all this morning. I apologize if I sound a little bit froggy. I woke up this morning with a great feeling of a cold coming on, so I apologize in advance. At least we're not together and present together where you would be catching my germs. So, thanks for being here. And I realized as I was preparing this, obviously I want to talk about the onboarding process, but there's so much to think about leading up to that, and I wanted to touch on a few areas. And it's great because I know you just came off a topic talking a little bit about performance management, so I think it's very timely as we look at it. So one of the things I want to talk about a little bit on the recruitment and selection aspect of things, an eye toward performance management, how we lean on our mission, vision, and values, and then talk practically about that, first few day experience leading into the first year of employment. And then also about how we work with effectively communicating and things that we need to be thinking about. So that's kind of where we're going to go today. Feel free if you want to raise your hand and interrupt me. You can if there's a question or something you want me to go into greater detail on. I'm easy to work with from that perspective. But one of the things I'll often begin with when getting a chance to talk to teams about anything related to HR, anything at all, is talking about an area of control. So whether you are sitting there as the HR manager, you are the manager, or you're the CEO or owner of the organization, control is important, right? The only area of control that we have is kind of on ourselves and what we do and how we interact with everybody. This is really important because obviously it sets the tone for how we can drive behavior, influence change, and make sure we're doing things, right by way of our team. And so I've been really very focused on the whole mindfulness piece because I realized that what we do, what we bring into the office, what we bring into the environment working with teams really matters. So I think I always say, let's make sure we have the right headspace as we do this because that has a greater impact. Now, I understand we can't control what other people do, right? That is going to be up to them and how they approach things, but we get to control ourselves and kind of our actions and how we approach things. So I always like to start with that as kind of like a freeing concept to begin with. The other thing I often like to share, particularly because I think this is really pertinent when it comes to thinking about onboarding, is looking at, why does someone leave an organization? So the number one reason why someone leaves an organization is for a perceived lack of value. And even more importantly, if we drive that home to think about why someone might leave within our first year or maybe in the first 2 years of employment, it's because they felt that they bought into a false sense of goods, that maybe what they thought they were walking into didn't turn out to be what they thought it would be. And this is really important when we think about effective onboarding and how are we looking at it. So one of the things I think is really important to think about, and the question you ask yourself is, how can you ensure a degree of transparency and authenticity that exists both when you hire and how you integrate an employee into your team? So those are great things to think about as you're looking at ways to kind of get going with it. So I know you already heard a little bit about performance management. And so obviously, I threw up a definition there, but I am really big on actually thinking about it a little bit more holistically. And one of the things beyond thinking about like what the stages of, whether it be coaching, corrective action, termination, or how we use metrics or things like that, those are all things I know you've probably heard ad nauseum about. But one of the things that for me, that I look at is it's a more holistic approach. And often use the term from recruitment to retirement. And that means that I am thinking about performance management from the minute I develop a job description, advertise, and look for somebody, all the way through the hiring process to getting them started, and then obviously beyond that point. And I don't know that we're always thinking like that when we're approaching performance management, but it's really important to do so because it sets the stage. Everything that we do in advance kind of sets that environment in motion for what's going to happen when that person actually starts. So just be thinking about that as we look at it. And then the other thing is, what's your culture? Obviously, if we're going to hire and bring somebody and integrate them onto our team, do we have a good understanding of what our culture is? What are those shared beliefs, the values and things that we have? When I look at performance management, I'm always looking at both the skill the person has, but also how are they aligning with who we are as an organization and our culture and who we are, and how does that work? And so obviously looking at what your brand is, like what is that? Are you ready to kind of share that and integrate that from a recruitment perspective and then as someone starting? Because your strong internal culture is the foundation of a powerful external brand. And so doing so helps you along the way to become that employer of choice and being somewhere that people actually want to be at the end of the day. So obviously thinking about your mission, the purpose, our aspirations, where we're going, and the values, who we are, and the guiding principles or beliefs that set us apart from other people. Do you know that going into this? Do you know that when you're going through the recruitment process? And how are you leveraging that through an interview process and as you integrate somebody when they join the team? One of the things I often talk about when we think about onboarding and the hiring process is what do we do even before we think about hiring somebody? And obviously on here is kind of the various stages of things that you do from a recruitment perspective. Um, Key important things for me to look at is the job analysis, our recruitment plan, and how we interview. So there's a key particularly that I focus on when I'm thinking about these things. What is a job analysis? This is really important because as you know, things change, right? So you're gonna like dust off that job description and you're gonna look and see what do I actually need to hire for? What's changed? What are the skills I'm looking for? What are the things that I know that I need to hire in terms of that cultural fit within the organization? All those pertinent things are really important because it helps you understand kind of where you're going and what you're doing, as part of that process. So keeping that in mind, then you go through more of like the plan. Obviously, I don't need to tell you how to recruit or things like that. But where are you going to find the people? How are you leveraging referrals from your current staff? How are you doing all of those things? And how are you going to communicate your mission, vision, and values to the world from a recruitment perspective? And then it comes down to the interview process. And this is why I think it's really important, again, that you're hiring and that you're setting kind of an authentic vision of who you are as an organization and as a team. I know we often think that we have to sell ourselves to a candidate to be able to get them on board, but you have to be really careful because you don't want to oversell, you don't want to overstate who you are, because doing so really makes it tricky for when you actually get that person started. So be really kind of honest, ask those great open-ended questions, use that situational-based question and answer, find out what their past experience is and how it aligns with kind of what you're looking at. And then also from an interview perspective, make sure that you're giving that person a good look at your team. So don't let it just be one person that they meet with. Let them meet with people from the team to see how they fit in with that whole context, the context of who you are as an organization. So that's really important and something you want to look at from an interview perspective. So let's say we've hired the person, we're getting ready. Let's talk practically about getting them started. And what I want to really emphasize to you all is make sure that you're prepared for their first day. Make sure that you're ready to go. Make sure that you have all the tools, the technology, and things aligned. It is so important. And I will even share a story. I started a job. I was the HR manager. I was hired. Day one, I walk in and I meet with the chief financial officer. And he's like, hey, I'm glad that you're here. Let's get through it. I'll show you your office. And he's like, let me know if you need anything. And have at it. So I go and I sit down in my brand new office that I'm in. And I immediately notice several things. One, there was no phone. There was no laptop and there was nothing there. And I thought, oh, okay. So let me go check in with the chief financial officer. So I go in and I say, hey, how does one go about getting a laptop? And he said, oh, just contact the help desk. Just give them a call. I said, great. How does one go about getting a phone? He goes, oh, yeah, let me get on that for you. So granted, I knew I was the HR person. This is something that I had to handle. But think about that. Like, you want to put your best foot forward to make sure that you're ready to go when they start. So I think that's really important to keep in mind as you go about it. The other thing is don't rush the onboarding and training process. I know sometimes it seems like it takes us forever to find the right person, and we want to make sure that we're doing everything right by that. But don't rush it. Make sure that you're spending the time needed to effectively onboard and train them throughout that process. Number one, engage the employee in understanding both the expectations, what the environment is like in the office, where they need to find essential pieces of information, and also start setting the stage for what the performance expectations are going to be. I'm going to say this again later because I want to emphasize how important it is. I think as a manager, if you're the person managing or you're the HR person managing the process, you want to establish what I call the rules of engagement for communication. Make it a two-way street. Start to understand how best to work with that person and what they might need and what you might need from them by way of establishing effective communication. Have that plan for the first week. Who should they be meeting with? What technology do they need? Do they have everything in place? Do they have all the supplies they need to perform their job functions? And have you engaged with them what they might need in addition to that? I always say spend some time with actual on-the-job training, or if you facilitate, some people will use like a training center and you go off to a training center and you have a trainer and you're doing all those things. That is fine, but you want to make sure that you're integrating as much on-the-job training as possible to really replicate what they're going to be doing on a regular basis. Because the more you do that, the better you're going to set them up for how things are going to go. Make sure that that employee gets to engage with other members of the team and also gets to meet people who they're going to have to work with in some capacity in some way, shape, or form. Don't assume that introductions have happened. Make sure you facilitated that to make sure that they do happen. For instance, if 3 months into the job, someone says, "Hey, I need to submit an expense report," and you're like, "Oh, just to give it to Tom in accounting," and they're like, "Who's Tom in accounting?" Right? Think through the who and make sure that they're understanding what that might look like. If you are the HR manager or you're their actual manager, you want to make sure you're checking in with the employees. So whether it's the HR side of things checking in daily or the manager checking in daily, you want to make sure that you have a good understanding of how things are going and if there are any specific questions that are popping up as part of that process. We always look at the introductory period. I know it's so common to say, hey, the first 90 days are the introductory period. For me, that's really important from an HR perspective. I really leverage the 30, 60, 90-day check-in. I don't really call it a review, but it kind of is in my mind. But it really is an opportunity to check in and see how things are going. Depending how you're set up and depending the number of people or how big your teams are, this can be something that can be shared among managers in HR and everyone can play a part in it. But I think it's really important to take place and make sure that you're following and doing it. One, infuse questions like, how are things going? What's great? What's challenging? Do you feel you have the right tools right now? Is there anything you're missing? When it comes to training, is there any challenges or things that you're experiencing that are causing you a headache? Having those conversations will help you understand two things. One, are they getting it? Right? Are they doing what they need to in terms of advancing through the role? Or is there a problem? Is there a red flag that's brewing that you're going to need to address? You want to make sure you're checking in with supervisors to see how they're feeling about things. And make sure through that 30, 60, 90-day period that employee does have face time with company leadership. I think it's really important for establishing those type of relationships that exist because it's going to be vitally important for them. If performance issues are identified during the period of employment of those 30, 60, 90 days, you want to make sure that you're addressing it and asking yourself the question is this something that's going to be problematic where this person may not make it? Or is it something that we really need to focus in on the right training and tools to ensure that they can be successful? So think about that from a perspective of that. If you don't feel like the person's going to make it, obviously it's okay to have them exit the organization before that 90 days. That helps limit your exposure from an unemployment standpoint. But also, you want to make sure that you're on top of those types of issues to make sure you're not, preventing something, huge from happening beyond that point. I found when I'm involved with the 30, 60, 90-day, I have found it very valuable to be able to see what I'm seeing and then kind of confirm that same experience with a manager to see if everyone's on the same page. But even more importantly, I do look at like the first 2 years of an employee engagement into an organization, which I know is kind of crazy to think about because if you think about the average tenure an employee has is 2.6 years with an organization. That's been kind of the going trend as of recent years. But if I'm looking at it, I'm always trying to think, how long can I make sure I can retain this person and have them be a part of the team? So I don't know how it's set up for each of your organizations in terms of the size of your teams and how things are set up. But you want to look at, are you doing weekly one-on-ones as a manager or as an HR person with your team? If not, how often are you getting that one-on-one time with your team? So one of the things I'm often thinking about in the first 2 years is one, obviously addressing things as they come up directly to making sure that things are, being handled okay. Two, I don't want an employee to be surprised by anything. So if they're surprised by a conversation that we're having, later, that means I'm not doing my job regularly at communicating things as they occur. I think it's always important to address what's going well, and often think it's just as important to talk about, where someone can develop further. And notice I'm saying develop further and not saying it's a weakness or a problem area yet, right? Because you're always trying to focus on that employee development. The other thing I want to make sure that I'm doing in that initial 2 year period is I'm really looking at their aptitude. You know, is this someone who is going to grow into a deeper role, advancement as we grow and the organization grows? Will they play a part in that? So that's something that I'm often looking at. 6 months, I'm often doing a check-in and a review. Same thing, what's going well, what challenges exist, what areas of development might be. I want employees to also provide a self-analysis of how they think that they're doing, making sure that things are aligned. But also, if we find that there's discrepancies in performance, making sure that we're not ignoring them and that we're addressing them and making sure there's a path forward and an alignment on that. I think the worst thing that I found is when you get to that 6 months and even that year, and the person's perception of how they're doing does not match the supervisor's perception of how they're doing. And so I really want to make sure we're doing everything we can to make sure that those things are aligned, that everyone's kind of on the same page when possible, because I realize that's not an absolute. But in addition, obviously, look at the annual review process. I know I don't have to go into that because I know you guys have talked a lot about that. My one piece of advice that I often give is when we talk about a scoring system for how we evaluate employees. I recommend that you use a scoring system that does not allow you to have what I call a middle of the road score. For instance, like if you're looking at a scoring system of like 1 to 5, that 3 is an average. I don't like average. I don't like using that as a score because I think that enables managers and even us as HR professionals sometimes to make it an easy answer. When I can tell you that no one A wants to be average, and number two really is average. You either are doing something well and it should be, acknowledge that you're doing it well, or that you need to be doing it better, which means that there's an opportunity for development there. So those are things that I think are really important to have in place as you're looking at that. Again, self-analysis is an important part of it. If you don't include self-analysis as part of your review process, I think you need to be doing that as early and as quickly as possible because employees need to be thinking about their own development. I also encourage as early as possible with your employees from an orientation standpoint on, is that you're looking at what is their path, right? We're seeing this, I think, a lot with, I think, the younger generations of the workforce. They want to know where they're going and they want to know now, right? So I think it's important. Obviously, I always want to leverage that employees should have patience about their development, but I also think it's important to talk about where and what they could be doing, and what is the timeline of which something like that could occur. So as soon as you're able to infuse in that, I think that helps particularly some of the generations we have in the workforce now who really crave that type of information. And again, I think as always, you want to avoid surprises and things with employees that should never really occur from a review process. So going back to kind of like that day one, or even before day one with employees, it's really important to establish effective communication. What are your rules of engagement? How do you communicate? And if it's not going to be your employee and you're working with your managers, I think it's really important to convey this to managers as well. Establish what works, right? For instance, if you're the person that does not want to like be surprised by a conversation, right, that you need some planning, then you might say, hey, if we're going to have a meeting, can I have some notice to figure out how that I'm prepared for it? Maybe the manager requests that, or maybe the employee might request that. Think about those things. Do they like to be communicated to via email, phone call? What are those things that can be in place to make sure that you're starting off on the right foot? Also, what type of learning style does your new employee benefit most from? Have you had some of those conversations? Are they best if they could just sit with a reading manual? Do they benefit from a classroom type of environment? Understanding those things might be able to help you better train and get them prepared for their role. Doing that initially is really important. Also, I want to talk about miscommunication because when during COVID, I was doing a lot of reading. I realized that so much of what I get involved with from a employee discipline or a corrective action or any type of employee issue, a lot of it stems from communication and or miscommunication. So again, going to things that we can control, make sure that we are communicating effectively from a leadership perspective, but also encouraging our team not to jump, to making, hasty assumptions, missing out on context of conversations that we're having, or also making sure we as leaders are making sure that we're establishing the right medium for communication, right? For instance, like, if it's something really important, you probably want to have that as a conversation and not something you're simply emailing across the board. Also, making sure that we are not falling short on active listening. Communication really is the art form of listening and receiving, and it's a two-way street. And so we need to make sure that we're doing that. So if we're not listening to our employees, we might be missing out on things that we might need to know. So the other part I think is really important. This comes into the idea of kind of the emotional intelligence piece, which I know some people probably get so exhausted talking about. But if we are trying to coach our manager or even doing this ourselves, we need to understand how we come across with others, right? Do we find times where people misunderstand us simply based on what we're talking about and what we're saying? Do they misinterpret our tone? These are things that we can control. And so I think it's really important to be focused on self-awareness, whether you're the HR, the manager, or how you're instilling this within your teams. The idea of, thinking before we speak, understanding our environment. The worst thing that we can do with our team, especially when they're new, is to create an environment where we are embarrass them, or that we talk about something important with other people around that make them feel self-conscious. Those are all things that we can control and that we can do. Obviously, being always aware of how we come across, and we look at the tone that we use, how we navigate the expressions and things like that, making sure that we are establishing at least an effective way to communicate with our new team members and our team members in general. And then also, especially when someone is new, how are they viewing what you're saying, right? As you're looking at them and as you're communicating with them, are you are they buying what you're selling, right? Are they with you, and do you need to adjust or pivot anyway? The other thing that I think is important, and this comes down to a foundational concept, I think, as a manager that we want to instill in our managers and in ourselves as we manage others. Um, because if we don't establish an effective working relationship, that means that we're not going to establish trust and respect. And those two things are foundational in order to have a successful working relationship with them. So I think it's really important to establish from day one, number one, be open and honest, be respectful and understanding, making sure that we're listening. If we've made a commitment to them, make sure that we keep that commitment and that we own it. Work on your charm, right? I think that this is something that I have to remind myself daily when working with others. I might wake up feeling like crap or feeling like I woke up on the wrong side of the bed, but I can't let that show with my team members, and I need to make sure I'm doing that. Always be careful how you come across an email or a text. Share credit when credit is due. Don't make assumptions about what someone's thinking without understanding exactly and making sure that you know. Make sure you do solicit feedback and invite conversations about topics as opposed to simply kind of directing conversations, particularly with new team members. I think that's important. And lastly, if we're thinking that we're still not connecting, what do we do? Make sure that we ask specific questions. Never live with ambiguity. I think that's something I've learned, particularly with any team member, particularly with new team members. I don't want to assume anything. Make sure that if we need to understand something more, make sure that we ask specific questions or get the clarity that we need. If we're communicating something important and you have the conversation, maybe make sure you follow up in writing to make sure everyone understands what you're doing. Um, the last two things, I think, remember their humanity and yours. At the end of the day, we are people, so are they, which means that things that we say and do will have an effect on them. And then one of the things too, lastly, to kind of close with, manage your emotions and make sure that you do things to kind of increase your emotional intelligence daily, because these are things that you can change and you can adapt over time. The other thing I think it's important, particularly as you approach your working relationships and in closing, is I think about these four things. What is your intention? Are you seeking to develop a positive working relationship with your team and your colleagues and your newbies at the end of the day? What are the actual words and things that you're using when you communicate? And what are your actions? Are your actions backing up what your words are saying? And in everything that you're doing as a manager, are you building trust and showing respect with your team? And you're aligning with the mission, vision, values of your organization. Those are all things to keep in mind. And that brings me to a kind of closure there. Are there any questions or anything that I might be able to? I know in like a 25-minute time period, we kind of go through a lot to talk about. But are there anything I can answer, questions go over at this point?
I don't see any posted at the moment,
All right.
Ben. But I do want to tell you that this is super impactful. I think a lot of us are going through some of these things right as we speak. And if you haven't started, you probably are all about all but there and getting them on your calendars. So great reminders. Love your intentionality. And yes, we all are humans. We don't get this right every time. And I think we can always do better. So I appreciate your
Absolutely.
encouragement. And I appreciate you finishing us off strong.